What declassified discovery proved a crazy theory was real. Story 1: The Venona Project. Soviet spies were everywhere in the US government, and McCarthy was still wrong. The Venona Project was a classified US Army signals intelligence effort that began in 1943 and continued in various forms until 1980, decrypting intercepted Soviet communications and revealing the scope of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States during the 1930s and 1940s. The decrypts, which were partially released publicly in 1995, confirmed something that had been dismissed as Cold War hysteria. Soviet intelligence had recruited a substantial number of American citizens to work as agents, and several of those agents had positions within the US government. The Venona decrypts confirmed that Julius Rosenberg had indeed passed atomic bomb information to the Soviets, corroborating the espionage conviction that his supporters had argued was a political persecution. They confirmed that Alger Hiss, the State Department official whose conviction for perjury related to espionage had been the defining cause of anti-communist politics for years, had indeed been a Soviet agent. They identified hundreds of other individuals who had worked for Soviet intelligence. The confirmation produces a complicated historical reckoning. The Soviet spies were real. The fear of Soviet infiltration was not paranoid invention. And Joseph McCarthy, the senator whose name became synonymous with anti-communist persecution, was still substantially wrong. McCarthy's specific accusations and targets were not primarily the actual Soviet agents. He was right that there were Soviet agents, and spectacularly careless about who specifically he was destroying. The reckless destruction of reputations, the false accusations, the bullying congressional hearings, all of that happened while the real spies, confirmed by Venona, were largely not the ones McCarthy was going after. The lesson is specific: that a genuine phenomenon being real does not validate any particular person's claims about who the participants are. Story 2: The theory that the FBI was systematically infiltrating, sabotaging, and destroying left-wing political organizations, civil rights groups, and anti-war movements in the United States was treated as the paranoid complaint of exactly the people who would be most motivated to make it up. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, dismissed these concerns publicly and maintained the position that the Bureau's activities were lawful domestic law enforcement. On March 8, 1971, a group calling itself the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into the FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole approximately 1,000 documents. They distributed copies to journalists. The documents included references to a program called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, and to specific operations against specific organizations. The documents were real. The Senate Select Committee investigation, led by Frank Church in 1975-76, confirmed and expanded what the stolen documents had revealed. Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI had conducted a systematic program of infiltrating organizations it considered subversive, which included not just Communist Party affiliates, but the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Liberation Movement, the American Indian Movement, and the Socialist Workers' Party, and had used a range of techniques to destroy them from within. The specific techniques documented are specific: planting false information to destroy marriages and professional relationships, sending fabricated letters designed to provoke violence between rival organizations, leaking derogatory personal information about leaders to journalists, using informants to entrap members in criminal activity, and, in the case of Black Panther Party leader Fred Hampton, providing tactical information to Chicago police that contributed to his assassination while he slept. The people who said the FBI was targeting legal political activity based on ideology were right. COINTELPRO is now in the history books. The organizations it destroyed are not coming back. Story 3: At the end of World War II, the victorious Allied powers had agreed that German war criminals would be prosecuted and that the denazification of Germany would be a primary objective of the occupation. The Nuremberg trials were the public face of this commitment, the principle that individuals were accountable for crimes against humanity, regardless of the orders they followed. or the expertise they possessed. Simultaneously, and classified from the public, a joint U.S. military and intelligence operation was recruiting the most technically valuable German scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers for American employment. Operation Paperclip, named for the paperclips used to attach positive biographical information to the files of scientists whose German records were being downplayed or falsified, brought over 1,100 German scientists to work in American universities, government agencies, and military installations. Wernher von Braun, the SS officer who designed the V-2 rockets using the forced labor of concentration camp prisoners, became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that took Americans to the moon. Arthur Rudolph, operations director at the Middlework underground factory where prisoners were worked to death building V-2s, received a NASA Distinguished Service Award. Walter Schreiber, who supervised medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners, was employed at the Air Force School of Medicine. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency processed the files, and the specific process documented in declassified records was the alteration of those files to remove information about German party membership, SS membership, and specific crimes. The State Department raised objections. President Truman stipulated that individuals who had been members of the German Party and were more than nominal participants in its activities were ineligible. The specific scientists brought over were members of the German Party and were more than nominal participants. The people who said America employed German war criminals were right. Story 4 on August 4, 1964. President Lyndon Johnson went on national television to announce that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked the US Maddox and the US Turner Joy in the Gulf of Tonkin, the second such attack in 2 days. Congress responded by passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. The Vietnam War, as Americans would experience it, began with that resolution. The August 2 attack on the Maddox was real. The August 4 attack, the one that triggered the resolution, did not happen. This was known within the Johnson administration almost immediately. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara received reports from naval commanders expressing serious doubt about whether any attack had occurred. Captain John Herrick, commander of the Naval Task Force, cabled Washington that the evidence for the attack was uncertain and that a complete evaluation should be conducted before action was taken. The NSA, which intercepted North Vietnamese communications, found no evidence of an attack. Johnson and McNamara presented the attack as confirmed to Congress and to the public. The resolution passed 416-0 in the House and 88-2 in the Senate. The declassification came in stages. McNamara acknowledged serious doubts about the August 4 incident in his 1995 memoir. In 2005, the NSA declassified a historical study of the Gulf of Tonkin episode that confirmed the intercepts used to support the attack claim had been misrepresented. The relevant intercepts actually described the August 2 attack, not an August 4 attack. The study concluded the August 4 attack almost certainly did not occur. Approximately 58,000 Americans died in a war whose legal authorization rested on a fabricated attack. Story 5 Operation Ajax, the CIA coup against Iran that America denied for 60 years in August 1953. The elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a coup that restored Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to power. The coup's proximate cause was Mossadegh's nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British company that had been extracting Iranian oil for decades while paying the Iranian government a small royalty, and whose nationalization Mossadegh undertook as a matter of Iranian sovereign control over Iranian resources. The British government, whose intelligence service ran its own operation called Operation Boot, enlisted the CIA. The CIA operation was called Operation Ajax. It involved bribery of Iranian military officers, the hiring of street gangs and provocateurs to stage anti-Mossadegh demonstrations, the manipulation of Iranian media, and the coordination of the military coup that ultimately removed Mossadegh from power and sent him to house arrest, where he remained until his death in 1967. The United States denied involvement for approximately 60 years. The standard position was that the 1953 events were an internal Iranian affair, that the United States had not orchestrated or funded the coup, and that the persistent claim of American involvement was Soviet-influenced anti-American propaganda. In 2013, the National Security Archive published a declassified CIA history of Operation Ajax that the agency had previously withheld. The document described in detail how the CIA, working with British intelligence, had planned and executed the coup. It described the CIA officer who ran the operation, the payments made to key Iranian figures, and the specific events that produced Mossadegh's overthrow. The Iranian Revolution of 1979, the hostage crisis, and much of the subsequent relationship between Iran and the United States traced directly to 1953. The people who said America overthrew Iran's democracy were right. It took 60 years to get the document. Story 6: The NSA Bulk Collection Program. The surveillance system the government said didn't exist for years before 2013. Various public figures and civil liberties organizations claimed that the National Security Agency was collecting communications data on American citizens at a scale that would constitute a mass surveillance program, that the legal authorities granted by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the Patriot Act were being interpreted in ways that swept up ordinary American communications, rather than targeting specific foreign intelligence subjects. The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, was asked directly about this at a Senate hearing in March 2013. Senator Ron Wyden, who had been briefed on classified programs, asked whether the NSA collected any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans. Clapper answered, "No, sir, not wittingly." In June 2013, NSA contractor Edward Snowden disclosed documents to journalists Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras that established what the programs actually did. The PRISM program collected internet communications from major tech companies. The telephony metadata program collected call detail records for virtually every phone call made in the United States. The numbers involved, the duration, the time, and the location, without a warrant and without individualized suspicion. The scale was precisely what civil liberties advocates had claimed: bulk collection of data on hundreds of millions of Americans. Clapper subsequently acknowledged that his congressional testimony was clearly erroneous and described the question as the hardest of all the ones in jeopardy. He was not prosecuted for perjury. The programs he denied continued, were debated in Congress, and were partially reformed through the USA Freedom Act of 2015. The specific legal theories authorizing the programs had been developed in secret and validated by a secret court. The public was told the programs didn't exist. They existed. Story 7: Operation Gladio. NATO's secret army of stay-behind terrorists across Western Europe. Operation Gladio was a classified NATO program established after World War II that created and maintained clandestine paramilitary networks throughout Western European countries, stay-behind networks that would, in the event of Soviet invasion, conduct guerrilla warfare against the occupiers. The networks were supplied with weapons caches, trained in sabotage and assassination, and kept secret from the governments and populations of the countries in which they operated. This would have been an extraordinary but arguably defensible Cold War security measure. What made Gladio a genuine scandal was the evidence that in several countries, most prominently Italy, the stay-behind networks had been involved in domestic terrorism rather than hypothetical anti-Soviet resistance. The theory of the strategy of tension, that right-wing elements in the security services had conducted bombings and assassinations attributed to the left in order to destabilize democratic governments and justify authoritarian responses, circulated in Italy for years and was treated as left-wing paranoia. Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti acknowledged Gladio's existence in October 1990, and parliamentary investigations in Italy and subsequently in other European countries established the program's scope. The investigations found evidence that members of the Gladio network and its Italian equivalent, Gladio Italia, had connections to specific terrorist incidents, including the Bologna railway station bombing of 1980, which ended 85 people. Whether the stay-behind networks were directly responsible for domestic terrorism or whether members of those networks acted independently is a distinction that the available evidence does not cleanly resolve. What the investigations established is that NATO had created and funded armed clandestine networks across Western Europe that operated outside democratic oversight, that those networks had connections to far-right extremism, and that in Italy specifically those connections extended to political violence. Story 8: The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. 400 black men were denied treatment for 40 years to watch them die from 1932 to 1972. The United States Public Health Service conducted a study in Macon County, Alabama, that enrolled approximately 399 black men who had syphilis and 201 uninfected men as controls. The men were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood. They were not told they had syphilis. They were not receiving effective treatment for it. The study's purpose was to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men. When penicillin became the established treatment for syphilis in the late 1940s, the study participants were not offered it. When local physicians attempted to treat study participants through independent programs, the Public Health Service intervened to prevent treatment. When participants were called up for military service in World War II, the Public Health Service worked to ensure they were exempted from induction, not out of concern for their health, but to ensure they remained available for study. The study continued for 40 years. It ended only when Peter Buxton, a Public Health Service venereal disease investigator, provided documentation to Associated Press journalist Gene Heller, who published the story in 1972. Congressional hearings followed. The study was terminated. The surviving participants received lifetime health benefits and burial expenses through a settlement that also established the requirement for informed consent in federally funded research, the Belmont Report framework that now governs research ethics. President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology in 1997. By then, most of the study participants had died. The documented consequences of the Tuskegee study's exposure extend beyond the immediate victims. Research has consistently found elevated medical distrust among Black Americans that traces measurably to awareness of the study, producing reduced engagement with healthcare that affects health outcomes for a population that did nothing wrong. Story 9: Operation Northwoods. The military planned to stage terrorist attacks on Americans and blame Cuba in March 1962. The Joint Chiefs of Staff submitted a memorandum to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, containing a proposal so extreme that McNamara rejected it immediately, and President Kennedy relieved the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of his post shortly afterward. The memorandum, signed by all of the Joint Chiefs, proposed a series of covert operations, codenamed Operation Northwoods, that would create the pretext for a U.S. military intervention in Cuba. The proposed operations included staging Cuban attacks on the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, including blowing up U.S. ships and fabricating U.S. casualties, sinking a boatload of Cuban refugees and blaming Cuba, shooting down a U.S. military drone aircraft over Cuba and claiming it was a manned aircraft, conducting a Remember the Maine incident in Cuban waters, developing a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington, and bombing buildings in Washington, D.C., Miami, and other cities. Attacks on American soil, on American citizens, designed to be attributed to Cuba. The document specifically noted that casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. Operation Northwoods was declassified as part of the records release related to the JFK assassination investigation in the late 1990s. It entered the public record in 2001 through investigative journalist James Bamford's book, Body of Secrets. The document is real. The Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States military proposed staging attacks on American citizens to provide justification for war. It was rejected, which is why it appears in the historical record as a rejected proposal rather than an executed one. The people who said the government would fabricate attacks to justify wars were, in this case, describing something the government actually proposed in writing. Story 10: The Church Committee's Assassination Plots. The CIA tried to kill at least 8 foreign leaders. The Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, the Church Committee, conducted its investigation between 1975 and 1976 and produced a report titled Alleged Assassination Plots Involving Foreign Leaders. The word "allege" in the title was a legal caution. The content of the report confirmed specific documented plots against specific individuals. The leaders against whom the CIA had developed or supported assassination plots, as confirmed by the committee, included Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, General Ren Schneider of Chile, and Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic. The committee also found evidence of plots against Ngo Dinh Diem of South Vietnam and François Papa-Doc Duvalier of Haiti, though the evidence was less conclusive. The finding that the United States government had systematically engaged in foreign assassination plots, including plots against leaders of countries with which it was not at war, using organized crime as operational partners, was explosive when the committee reported it. The committee recommended explicit legislative prohibition of assassination as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. Executive orders banning political assassination were subsequently issued by Presidents Ford, Carter, and Reagan. Whether those orders changed practice or merely changed the paper trail is a question that subsequent history, including drone strike programs and targeted killing policies, leaves open. Story 11: Project Shamrock. The NSA was reading every international telegram sent from the U.S. for 30 years beginning in 1945 and continuing until its exposure in 1975. The National Security Agency and its predecessor organizations ran a program called Project Shamrock, in which the 3 major international telegraph companies, Western Union, RCA Global, and IT World Communications, provided the NSA with copies of all international telegrams passing through their facilities. Every international telegram sent from or to the United States, every one. The companies cooperated voluntarily, without legal compulsion, having been persuaded that national security required it. The arrangement was entirely extra-legal. No court had authorized it. No law specifically permitted it, and the communications of American citizens were swept up along with everything else. Shamrock was exposed by the Church Committee investigation in 1975. The NSA director testified before the committee that the program had been probably the most troublesome and sensitive program the NSA ran. A separate program, Minaret, was revealed simultaneously. The NSA had maintained watch lists of American citizens, anti-war protesters, civil rights leaders, journalists, and routed their communications for special handling. The exposure of Shamrock produced the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, which was intended to create a court system to oversee signals intelligence collection against Americans. FISA established the FISA Court. The Church Committee hearing where Shamrock was revealed included the following exchange. A senator asked the NSA director whether the program represented the largest surveillance program of any democracy in history. The director responded that he didn't know of anything comparable. The people who said the government was reading everyone's mail were describing what the government was literally doing for 30 years. Story 12: Operation Sea Spray. The Navy aerosolized bacteria over San Francisco and called it a test in September 1950. The United States Navy conducted a covert operation off the coast of San Francisco, using a minesweeper to spray clouds of Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigi bacteria over the city and the surrounding Bay Area. The operation lasted approximately a week and was conducted without the knowledge or consent of San Francisco's residents. The bacteria were selected because they were believed to be harmless and because Serratia marcescens produces a distinctive red pigment that allowed tracking of the dispersal. The stated purpose was to test how effectively a biological warfare agent could be covertly dispersed over a large city. The Navy wanted to understand the potential vulnerability of American urban populations to biological attack, and, implicitly, to assess the potential effectiveness of offensive biological aerosol weapons. Within days of the operation, Stanford University Hospital reported an unusual cluster of patients infected with Serratia marcescens, a rare pathogen that had never previously appeared in the hospital's records in significant numbers. At least one patient, a retired pipefitter named Edward Nevin, died from a Serratia infection. His family subsequently sued the government, arguing that the Navy's test had caused his death. The Army and Navy conducted hundreds of similar open-air biological warfare tests in American cities across the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s. The full extent of these tests was revealed through congressional investigations in 1977. Tests were conducted over Minneapolis, St. Louis, New York City, and other locations, using various bacteria and chemical simulants. The specific claim that the government was testing biological agents on American citizens without their knowledge was, when people made it, treated as paranoid. It was confirmed by Senate hearings in 1977. Story 13 Cointelpro and the assassination of Fred Hampton was 21 years old, and the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party when Chicago police shot him to death in his apartment at approximately 4:45 am on December 4, 1969. The police initially described the incident as a gunfight in which Hampton and fellow Panther Mark Clark had opened fire on officers serving a search warrant. The characterization was specific. The Panthers had been the aggressors. The officers had responded defensively. The physical evidence at the apartment, examined independently by journalists, lawyers, and eventually a federal grand jury, told a different story. Forensic analysis found that 98 to 99% of the gunshots in the apartment had been fired by the police, entering from outside. Hampton was shot twice in the head, both shots fired at close range while he was apparently in bed. Witnesses stated he was unconscious before the raid began, possibly having been sedated. An FBI informant had provided Hampton's detailed floor plan to the Chicago police, and some accounts suggest the informant had placed a barbiturate in Hampton's food the night before. The FBI had been monitoring Hampton intensively under Cointelpro. The informant who provided the floor plan, William O'Neill, was on the FBI payroll. The degree to which the FBI's involvement in providing tactical intelligence to Chicago police constituted participation in Hampton's assassination has been legally contested and politically debated for decades. A federal civil lawsuit filed by Hampton's family was settled in 1982 for $1.85 million, paid by the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, and the federal government, without any admission of wrongdoing. The settlement amount and the government parties who paid it tell their own story about what the available evidence suggested. Story 14, the Stasi Files. East Germany's secret police had files on a third of its own population. The Ministry for State Security of East Germany, the Stasi, was dissolved in 1990 following the fall of the Berlin Wall and German reunification. When the records were secured by civic activists who physically occupied Stasi buildings to prevent document destruction, the scale of the surveillance infrastructure they found was staggering in specific documented ways. The Stasi had approximately 91,000 full-time employees and approximately 173,000 unofficial informants, a ratio of approximately 1 informant for every 63 East German citizens, a concentration of surveillance without historical parallel in any known police state, including the families of informants. Estimates suggest that a third of the East German population was either informing on or being informed upon by their colleagues, neighbors, friends, and family members. The files the Stasi maintained on citizens it was monitoring were detailed to a degree that now seems almost incomprehensible. The files included not just reports of activities and conversations, but physical samples of the target's odor, cloths that the target had sat on, stored in sealed jars so that tracking dogs could identify the person if they became a fugitive. The Zerschätzung program, psychological harassment designed to slowly destroy targeted individuals without detectable physical violence, had its protocols documented in Stasi training manuals. After reunification, East Germans were given the right to access their own files. People discovered that their spouses, their parents, their closest friends had been reporting on them. The psychological consequences for relationships and communities are documented in sociological literature on post-reunification Germany. The Stasi files are now held at a German federal archive and have been extensively studied. What they reveal about the specific mechanics of a surveillance state and about what it does to human relationships and trust is available to anyone who reads the research. Story 15: Agent Orange. The military knew the herbicide was causing cancer in soldiers, and farmers' Agent Orange was an herbicide mixture, approximately half 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid and half 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, used by the United States military in the Operation Ranch Hand aerial herbicide program in Vietnam from 1961 to 1971. Approximately 77 million liters were sprayed across Vietnamese jungles, mangroves, and agricultural land to deny cover and food to enemy forces. The 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid component was contaminated during manufacturing with a dioxin compound called TCDD, one of the most toxic synthetic chemicals known, a confirmed carcinogen and developmental toxin. The contamination was known to manufacturers Dow Chemical and Monsanto. Internal documents declassified and released through litigation have established that the chemical companies knew about the dioxin contamination and its toxicity from their own manufacturing research, did not disclose it to the military, and continued production. American veterans who served in areas where Agent Orange was sprayed reported elevated rates of specific cancers, neurological conditions, and reproductive health problems at rates that Veterans Affairs took decades to formally acknowledge and compensate. Vietnamese civilians, the farmers and their families whose land was treated, experienced similar elevated rates of cancers and birth defects in subsequent generations. The Red Cross of Vietnam estimates that 3 million people have been affected by Agent Orange exposure, including approximately 150,000 children born with serious deformities. Declassified military and corporate documents established that concerns about the herbicide's toxicity were raised by scientists within the programs and were suppressed or managed through the same mechanisms documented across the entries on this list: the suppression of inconvenient research, the management of regulatory risk, and the continuation of a program whose costs were borne by people who had no voice in the decision to expose them. Story 16: Operation Mockingbird. The CIA ran agents inside American journalism for decades. The Church Committee's investigations into intelligence community abuses produced, among other findings, documented confirmation that the CIA had maintained relationships with American journalists, editors, and media executives for decades, using those relationships to place intelligence-serving information in the American press, suppress stories damaging to the CIA's interests, and gather information from journalists' overseas sources. CIA Director William Colby told the Church Committee in 1975 that the agency had approximately 50 assets in the news media, a number that subsequent research suggests significantly understated the actual scope of the program. Investigative journalist Carl Bernstein, in a 1977 Rolling Stone article based on extensive research including CIA sources, described a program that at its height involved more than 400 American journalists who had secretly carried out assignments for the CIA and included executives at the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS News, Time, and other major outlets. The program, which Bernstein called Operation Mockingbird in reference to a specific organizational component, involved a range of relationships. Some journalists were paid CIA agents who conducted espionage under journalistic cover. Some received intelligence that they published as their own reporting. Some allowed the CIA to review stories before publication. Some were simply cultivated as sources of information about their contacts and their travels. CIA Director George H.W. Bush announced in 1976 that the CIA would no longer use journalists as paid agents or enter into relationships with journalists that might imply that they are reporting under CIA direction. The announcement explicitly did not cover unpaid relationships or relationships with foreign journalists. Whether the program ended, modified, or simply became more careful after the announcement is a question that subsequent history has not definitively answered. Story 17: The Phoenix Program. The CIA ran a systematic assassination and torture program in Vietnam. The Phoenix Program was a joint CIA South Vietnamese military operation that ran from 1965 to 1972, designed to identify and neutralize, through capture, defection, or killing, the civilian infrastructure of the National Liberation Front. The South Vietnamese insurgency that coordinated with North Vietnamese forces. The program operated through provincial reconnaissance units, which were South Vietnamese paramilitary forces trained and funded by the CIA, and through intelligence networks that gathered information about suspected NLF members and sympathizers. The program's neutralization statistics, the numbers reported as captured, defected, or ended, are documented. By the program's own statistics, it neutralized approximately 81,000 people between 1968 and 1972, with approximately 26,000 of those being killed. Vietnamese government statistics from the period report somewhat different numbers. The specific figures depend on which source is used and which years are included. The specific character of the program that made it controversial was documented in congressional testimony, journalist accounts, and participant memoirs: arbitrary arrest of civilians based on informant accusation, torture during interrogation, and the killing of individuals who had been targeted without legal process. William Colby, who ran the program from 1968 to 1971 before becoming CIA director, testified before Congress about the program and acknowledged the killing statistics. He maintained that the program operated with legal procedures and genuine intelligence value. Critics, including veterans who participated, described something closer to institutionalized murder. The Phoenix Program is confirmed history. The systematic targeting and killing of civilians based on suspected political association, conducted by a U.S. government program, is documented in U.S. government records. Whether it was effective counterinsurgency or a war crime has been debated ever since. Story 18: For years, people who claimed the CIA was conducting mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens were treated as paranoid. The idea that a government agency would dose civilians with LSD, torture prisoners in the name of science, and attempt to produce programmed human beings was filed under the category of things that sounded too monstrous to be real. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKUltra files. The order was specific and deliberate, not routine document retention management, but the elimination of records from a program he knew was indefensible. The program would have remained largely unknown if a CIA employee had not stored boxes of financial records off-site from the main archive, presumably because financial records were less obviously incriminating. Those boxes surfaced in 1977 through a FOIA request. The Church Committee investigation that followed confirmed what they contained. The CIA had run approximately 150 research projects between 1953 and 1973, studying hypnosis, electroconvulsive therapy, sensory deprivation, and the use of LSD and other drugs, conducted on prisoners, patients, and civilians who had not consented, some of whom did not survive the experiments intact. The specific facts are more disturbing than the general claim. A CIA safe house in San Francisco employed women to lure men inside so agents could dose them with ELST through a one-way mirror. A U.S. Army biological weapons researcher named Frank Olson died after being secretly dosed. His death was initially ruled a suicide and later reinvestigated with strong suspicion of murder. Psychiatric patients at a Canadian hospital were subjected to weeks of drug-induced sleep combined with electroshock at doses designed to erase their personalities. The people who said the government was running mind control programs were right. The evidence was burned. What survived confirmed the claim. Story 19: the U.S. gave German war criminal Josef Mengele a visa and let him escape. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz physician who conducted lethal experiments on concentration camp prisoners, who performed surgeries without anesthesia, who ended twins to compare their autopsies, and who sent approximately 400,000 people to the gas chambers as the selection officer on the Auschwitz ramp, entered the United States in 1949, 4 years after the war, using his own name. He stayed for several months before leaving for Argentina. The declassified record on how this happened is uncomfortable in its specificity. U.S. Army intelligence records and subsequent investigations, including a Justice Department task force report released in 2006, established that Mengele's name was on Allied war crimes lists, that his presence in the U.S. Army's post-war detention was known within the system, and that he was released from detention and allowed to emigrate without the connection being made to the wanted war criminal. The Gehlen Organization, the post-war intelligence network built on former German intelligence officers, which the CIA integrated into its Cold War operations, provided cover and operational assistance to numerous former Nazis who were considered useful to American intelligence. Whether Mengele specifically benefited from this protection network or escaped through ordinary bureaucratic failure is a distinction that the available records do not cleanly resolve. The Mengele case is the most extreme example of a broader documented pattern. War crimes prosecution was consistently subordinated to Cold War intelligence recruitment. Operation Paperclip is the most famous such subordination, but the Mengele case illustrates that the failure to prosecute was not limited to scientists with useful technical knowledge. Mengele had no technical knowledge the Americans needed. He simply moved through a system that was not looking for him with the urgency that the charge of his crimes would suggest. Story 20: Chaos. The CIA spent 7 years spying on anti-war protesters and finding nothing. Operation Chaos was a domestic surveillance program run by the CIA's counterintelligence staff from 1967 to 1974, directed specifically at the anti-war and civil rights movements in the United States. The program's stated objective was to identify foreign intelligence influence on domestic protest movements, specifically to find evidence that the Soviet Union or other foreign governments were directing or funding the anti-war movement. The program was, by its own performance metric, a complete failure. After 7 years of surveillance covering an estimated 7,200 American citizens and 1,000 domestic organizations, with files maintained on those individuals and organizations, informants placed inside protest groups, and intelligence collected from FBI, NSA, military intelligence, and foreign liaison services, the program found essentially no evidence of meaningful foreign direction or control of the American anti-war movement. Americans were opposing the Vietnam War because they opposed the Vietnam War. This was the finding. The CIA produced this finding after 7 years of illegal domestic surveillance of American citizens and the creation of a database of 300,000 names. The program was illegal on its face. The CIA's statutory charter explicitly prohibited domestic operations. It was conducted anyway, authorized by CIA Director Richard Helms at the request of President Johnson, and continued under Nixon. It was exposed by the Church Committee in 1975. The program is historically important, not because it found what it was looking for, but because of what it reveals about institutional priorities. 7 years, 300,000 names, zero evidence of what was being sought, continued operation. The continuation did not depend on the program producing results. It depended on the program serving the interests of presidents who wanted the anti-war movement characterized as foreign-directed. Story 21: The Pentagon Papers. The government knew the Vietnam War was unwinnable and kept sending boys to die. The Pentagon Papers were a classified Department of Defense study, commissioned in 1967 by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, examining the history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968. The study was completed in January 1969. Its findings were that multiple administrations had systematically deceived the public and Congress about the progress of the war, the feasibility of achieving stated objectives, and the rationale for escalation decisions. Daniel Ellsberg, a Rand Corporation analyst who had worked on the study and on Vietnam policy, became convinced after Tet 1968 that the war was not winnable and that the public was entitled to know what the government knew about its own prospects. He secretly photocopied the 7,000-page study over a period of months using a friend's photocopier and eventually provided copies to the New York Times. The Times began publishing excerpts in June 1971. The Nixon administration obtained an injunction stopping publication, the first prior restraint of a major American newspaper in American history. The Supreme Court reversed the injunction 6-3 within 2 weeks, with 6 justices holding that the government had not met the burden required for prior restraint. The specific findings of the Pentagon Papers were specific, that the Johnson administration had systematically misled Congress about the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, that the military had consistently provided optimistic assessments that contradicted internal analyses showing the war was not going as described, that the escalation decisions were made with internal knowledge that they were unlikely to achieve their stated goals. The gap between what 4 administrations told the American public about Vietnam and what their own analysts privately believed was documented in 7,000 pages of government records. Story 22, the Lusitania's cargo. The ship that brought America into Dubwe was carrying weapons. The sinking of the Armem's Lusitania by a German submarine on May 7, 1915, killing 1,198 people, including 128 Americans, is the event most commonly credited with galvanizing American public opinion against Germany and contributing to U.S. entry into World War I in 1917. Germany's defense, that the Lusitania was a legitimate military target because it was carrying war material for Britain, was treated at the time as propaganda and officially denied by the British and American governments. The cargo manifests, classified and held by the British Admiralty, were declassified decades later. They confirmed that the Lusitania was carrying approximately 4.2 million rounds of rifle ammunition, 1,250 cases of shrapnel shells, and 18 cases of fuse components, materials that under the laws of naval warfare of the period made the ship a legitimate military target under German interpretation. The German government had published advertisements in American newspapers in the days before the sailing, warning that ships entering the war zone around Britain were liable to destruction. The advertisements appeared in papers in the same cities where Cunard was advertising the Lusitania voyage. The specific decision-making about whether to delay the sailing, whether to escort the ship, and how to route it through known submarine-patrolled waters has been the subject of sustained historical inquiry. The theory that the Lusitania was used as a deliberate lure, that the British or Americans allowed or even encouraged the sinking to bring the U.S. into the war, is not supported by the evidence and is the conspiracy extension beyond what the documents establish. What the documents establish is narrower. The British government denied the military cargo existed. The denial was false, and the American public formed its opinion about the sinking based on a materially incomplete account. Story 23, the Iran-Contra affair. The government ran an illegal arms dealing operation out of the White House basement in 1986. A Lebanese newspaper published a story about U.S. officials secretly selling arms to Iran, which was under an arms embargo and which the United States officially classified as a state sponsor of terrorism, in apparent exchange for the release of American hostages held in Lebanon by Iran-backed groups. The Reagan administration denied it, then partially admitted it. Then the story became significantly more complex. National Security Council staff member Oliver North, working from the White House basement, had been running a covert operation that used the proceeds from the Iranian arms sales to fund the Nicaraguan Contra rebels, circumventing a congressional prohibition on providing such funding called the Boland Amendment. The operation violated the Boland Amendment, the Arms Export Control Act, and the requirement for congressional notification of covert operations. Congressional hearings in 1987 produced dramatic televised testimony from North, who acknowledged the operations and characterized them as serving legitimate national security purposes. The Tower Commission investigation and the independent counsel investigation led by Lawrence Walsh established the basic facts. The arms sales happened. The Contra diversion happened. Multiple senior officials knew. And the National Security Council had been used to conduct an operation specifically designed to avoid the congressional oversight that the law required. 14 individuals were charged criminally. 11 were convicted. Several convictions were overturned on appeal due to the immunity granted for congressional testimony. President George H.W. Bush pardoned 6 convicted officials in December 1992 after losing his re-election bid and before they could testify in further proceedings. The specific claim that the government was running illegal arms operations and funding illegal paramilitary activity from the White House was confirmed. The consequences for the individuals responsible were modest. Story 24, Operation Mockingbird in Academia: How the CIA Funded Intellectual Life During the Cold War. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was a CIA-funded organization that operated from 1950 to 1967, funding intellectual and artistic life across the non-communist world, sponsoring magazines, art exhibitions, music performances, academic conferences, and the work of writers, poets, and scholars who might otherwise have had difficulty obtaining resources. The CIA's involvement was secret. The participants generally did not know the source of their funding. The funded publications included Encounter magazine in Britain, Proofs in France, Der Monat in Germany, Tempo Presente in Italy, and equivalents across multiple countries. These were serious publications featuring serious writers on serious subjects, not crude propaganda, but sophisticated cultural output that happened to be funded by American intelligence. Many of the writers and intellectuals whose work appeared in these magazines were genuine critics of Soviet communism, whose work was published because it advanced Western interests, even if they didn't know who was paying. The exposure came in 1967 when Ramparts magazine published an investigation into CIA funding of the National Student Association, which triggered further investigation of the broader cultural funding network. The New York Times and other outlets reported on the CIA Congress for Cultural Freedom connection. The revelation produced a genuine reckoning in the intellectual community about the compromised independence of institutions that had been used as instruments of Cold War cultural policy. The specific effect on the credibility of anti-communist cultural production, on the question of whether the most influential cultural voices of the Cold War period were expressing their genuine views, or views subsidized by an intelligence agency, is one that the intellectual history of the period is still working through. Story 25, The Nayirah Testimony. A Kuwaiti princess lied to Congress to start a war on October 10, 1990. A 15-year-old girl named Nayirah testified before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, describing what she claimed to have witnessed as a volunteer in a Kuwait City hospital after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Her testimony was specific and devastating. She described Iraqi soldiers entering the hospital's neonatal ward, removing babies from their incubators, and leaving them on the cold floor to die. The testimony was broadcast widely and cited repeatedly by President George H.W. Bush, who mentioned it multiple times in the weeks before the congressional vote authorizing the Gulf War. Several senators cited the incubator story in their floor speeches supporting the war resolution. The vote passed 52-47 in the Senate, a margin narrow enough that individual pieces of evidence could plausibly have influenced the outcome. Nayirah's last name was not provided at the hearing, ostensibly to protect her family in Kuwait. She was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, and her testimony had been arranged by Hill & Knowlton, a public relations firm working for the Kuwaiti government. She had not been in Kuwait City during the Iraqi occupation. The incubator story was fabricated. Investigative journalist John MacArthur established these facts in a 1992 article and subsequent book. Amnesty International, which had initially repeated the incubator claim, investigated and retracted it. 2 ABC News producers reported finding no evidence the incubator killings had occurred. The Human Rights Caucus had not required testimony under oath. The specific mechanism, a fabricated atrocity story placed by a public relations firm, delivered by a prepared witness whose identity was concealed, repeated by the president, produced a congressional vote. Story 26, the DCIA's secret torture program. Enhanced interrogation was torture and didn't work. After September 11, 2001, the CIA developed and implemented a program of enhanced interrogation techniques for use on high-value detainees held at secret facilities, black sites, outside American territory, and outside the normal military detention system. The techniques were approved through a legal memo from the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, the UBIB memo, which defined torture in a way specifically designed to exclude the techniques being proposed. The techniques included waterboarding, sleep deprivation for periods of up to 180 hours, confinement in small boxes, stress positions, facial slapping, and various combinations. The CIA briefed select members of Congress on the program. The program's existence was classified. The Senate Intelligence Committee investigation, conducted from 2009 to 2014 under the chairmanship of Dianne Feinstein, reviewed 6.3 million pages of CIA records. The committee's 6,700-page report, a 500-page summary of which was declassified and published in December 2014, found that the techniques used were more brutal than what had been described to Congress and to the Justice Department, that the program did not produce unique or actionable intelligence, that the CIA had repeatedly misrepresented both the techniques and the results to oversight bodies, and that the CIA had actively impeded the committee's investigation. The CIA disputed the committee's findings about the program's effectiveness. The dispute is documented and specific. The committee's report includes the CIA's response as an appendix. The individuals who designed and implemented the program were not prosecuted. The lawyers who wrote the legal opinions authorizing it returned to private practice. The Senate Intelligence Committee staff who investigated it found their computers hacked by the CIA during the investigation. Story 27, the DIA and Contras. U.S. agencies allowed drug trafficking to fund the Nicaraguan rebels. The Iran-Contra investigation that followed the 1986 revelations produced one line of inquiry that its principal investigators chose not to pursue aggressively. The allegation that CIA and DIA officers had knowingly allowed cocaine to be transported into the United States by Contra-affiliated networks in exchange for Contra receipt of the proceeds and continued Contra operations. The Kerry Committee, the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics and International Operations of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by Senator John Kerry, investigated these claims separately from the main Iran-Contra investigation. Its 1989 report reached specific findings that Contra drug trafficking was real, that it involved specific named individuals and organizations, that U.S. officials knew about it and allowed it to continue, and that the State Department paid companies that were simultaneously being investigated by the DIA for drug trafficking to transport supplies to the Contras. The Kerry report did not conclude that the CIA officially sanctioned drug trafficking as policy. It found something structurally similar, that the network of relationships the CIA had with Contra operations and with the trafficking networks that funded them produced a situation where drug money flowed to the Contras with the knowledge of American officials who chose not to intervene. The 1998 CIA Inspector General report on the Contra drug trafficking question, released in response to a San Jose Mercury News investigation by journalist Gary Webb, confirmed that CIA had relationships with individuals involved in drug trafficking and had not reported this to the DIA, in some cases claiming authority from the Attorney General that would have allowed it to use drug traffickers as assets without reporting requirements. Webb's Mercury News investigation had been attacked aggressively by major newspapers. The Inspector General's report substantially confirmed his core findings. Story 28, Echelon. The Five Eyes were running a global communications interception network from the 1960s. Echelon is the code name for a signals intelligence collection and analysis network operated by the intelligence agencies of the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, that by the late 20th century was monitoring a substantial fraction of the world's satellite communications, microwave transmissions, phone calls, and internet traffic. The program's existence was described by various researchers and journalists from the 1970s onward, and was consistently denied or dismissed by the participating governments. The scale claimed a global interception network analyzing communications for keywords across multiple languages was described as technically implausible by government officials who declined to confirm or deny anything specific. The European Parliament commissioned a report on Echelon in 2001, following concerns from European businesses that the network was being used for commercial espionage, that the US was collecting intelligence on European corporate negotiations and using it to benefit American companies. The European Parliament report concluded that Echelon's existence was confirmed, that it was capable of intercepting communications globally, and that there was evidence it had been used for commercial intelligence as well as security purposes. The 2013 Snowden disclosures provided the most comprehensive public documentation of the Five Eyes collection infrastructure, confirming the existence of programs consistent with what Echelon watchers had described for decades: global collection, keyword analysis, sharing among the Five Eyes partners, and collection that extended well beyond the security-specific targets that governments described as the program's scope. The specific claim that a global communications interception network existed, operated by an alliance of English-speaking nations, monitoring civilian communications without public acknowledgement, was accurate from at least the 1960s onward. Story 29: The enriched uranium sold to Israel, the nuclear smuggling case that was never prosecuted. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a Pennsylvania company called Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation, NUMEC, processed highly enriched uranium under government contracts at its Apollo, Pennsylvania facility. Between 1957 and 1965, approximately 206 pounds of highly enriched uranium was reported missing from the facility, enough to produce several nuclear weapons. The FBI and the Atomic Energy Commission investigated. The CIA concluded in a classified assessment that the uranium had likely been diverted to Israel. NUMEC's founder, Zalman Shapiro, had documented connections to Israeli intelligence. Israeli intelligence officers had visited the NUMEC facility. The specific quantity of missing material was sufficiently large that operational error or measurement discrepancy could not fully explain it. No one was ever prosecuted. The investigation was managed in a way that those who participated in it later described as deliberately constrained. Witnesses not interviewed, leads not followed, conclusions managed rather than pursued. Multiple government officials who reviewed the case over the subsequent decades have said they believe the uranium was diverted to Israel's nuclear weapons program. The full classified record on the NUMEC case has not been released. The Government Accountability Office investigated in 1978 and found significant gaps. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission investigation produced a classified report that has not been declassified in full. The specific claim that weapons-grade uranium was stolen from American facilities and transferred to Israel's nuclear weapons program with the knowledge or acquiescence of elements of the American government is not confirmed in the way that a prosecution or a full document release would confirm it. It is supported by the specific pattern of a serious investigation that was not permitted to reach its natural conclusion. Story 30: The Smoking Gun Tape. Nixon said on camera he wanted to obstruct justice, the specific reason Richard Nixon resigned the presidency on August 9, 1974, is documented in a single tape recording made on June 23, 1972, 6 days after the Watergate break-in. In the recording, Nixon and his chief of staff H.R. Haldeman discussed using the CIA to instruct the FBI to limit its Watergate investigation on grounds of protecting CIA operations. This is obstruction of justice in the clearest possible form, and it is documented in Nixon's own voice. This recording, the smoking gun tape, was released on August 5, 1974, under Supreme Court order compelling Nixon to turn over subpoenaed recordings. 10 of the 11 Republican members of the House Judiciary Committee who had voted against articles of impeachment immediately announced they would change their votes. Nixon resigned 4 days later. The Nixon case is included on this list not because the Watergate scandal requires vindication. It is thoroughly established history, but because of the specific epistemological lesson the smoking gun tape provides. Nixon's own inner circle, including people who remained personally loyal to him through most of the process, said they were confident until the tape's release that Nixon had not ordered the cover-up. The tape said otherwise in his own voice. What the tape established is that the gap between what powerful people do and what they say they have done can persist through years of denial, congressional testimony, and criminal investigation, and can collapse in a matter of days when the specific evidence becomes available. The specific evidence in this case was his own recordings. Nixon had installed a recording system in the White House specifically so he could control the record of his presidency. The system recorded the evidence of the crime. Story 31 Project 1794. The Air Force really did build a flying saucer in 2012. The U.S. National Archives released a set of previously classified documents from the early 1960s that included the blueprints, performance specifications, and progress reports for a U.S. Air Force program to develop a circular supersonic aircraft, a genuine saucer-shaped flying vehicle under the project designation 1794. The documents revealed that the Air Force had contracted with Avro Canada to develop a disc-shaped aircraft capable of reaching speeds exceeding Mach 4 and altitudes above 100,000 feet. The project built on earlier work with the Avrocar, a smaller disc-shaped prototype that had been publicly disclosed, and envisioned a much more capable vehicle using a circular wing platform to achieve sustained supersonic flight. The project was canceled before the advanced vehicle reached prototype stage for a combination of technical and budgetary reasons, and the Avrocar itself proved capable of only modest speeds and altitudes in testing. But the specific fact that the Air Force was developing and test-flying unconventional aircraft of saucer-like shape during the peak years of civilian UFO sightings, roughly 1947 to 1969, is confirmed in the declassified documents. The CIA acknowledged in its own historical documents, released in 1997, that a significant number of civilian UFO sightings during the late 1950s and 1960s were caused by the U-2 spy plane and SR-71 Blackbird operating at altitudes and speeds that the public did not know were achievable, and that the agency had allowed the misidentifications to persist because correcting them would have required disclosing the classified aircraft programs. The people who saw unusual aircraft and reported it were seeing unusual aircraft. The government that knew what those aircraft were let the UFO explanation stand. Story 32 The Black Budget. The intelligence community had a $52 billion budget that Congress didn't know the details of. The Snowden disclosures of 2013 included a document that had not been expected. A detailed breakdown of the National Intelligence Program budget for fiscal year 2013. A 178-page document called the Black Budget that specified spending across 16 intelligence agencies, broken down by program, capability, and objective. The specific top-line number was $52.6 billion. The CIA received the largest share, $14.7 billion. The NSA received $10.8 billion. The National Reconnaissance Office, which operates spy satellites, received $10.3 billion. These numbers were, for the first time, available to the public. The black budget's existence was not secret. Congress had been voting appropriations for intelligence activities for decades. What had not been public was the specific breakdown, which agencies were doing what with how much money. Members of Congress who were not on the intelligence committees had been voting authorization bills without knowing the specific allocations. The document also provided something more useful than the top-line numbers: program descriptions that allowed intelligence analysts and journalists to understand what specific capabilities the intelligence community was prioritizing, what programs were succeeding, and what the overall strategic direction of U.S. intelligence collection looked like. The intelligence community's response to the black budget release characterized the disclosure as a serious compromise of national security. The specific national security damage produced by public knowledge of the intelligence budget allocation, as opposed to the damage from the operational program details Snowden also released, is difficult to characterize, since most adversaries can develop rough estimates of U.S. intelligence spending from open sources. What the black budget established was a number. The public now knew roughly what was being spent. The specific programs remained largely described in classification language. Story 33, Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA ran brothels in San Francisco and New York to drug unwitting men. This is a story that sounds like the kind of thing only a paranoid person would believe. The CIA ran safe houses in San Francisco and New York, furnished apartments where they employed women to bring men back from bars. When the men arrived, CIA operatives dosed their drinks with lest without their knowledge and observed their behavior through one-way mirrors. The operation ran for approximately a decade. The specifics are confirmed in CIA documents that survived the 1973 records destruction because they were stored in a financial records facility rather than the main archive. The Church Committee investigation in 1977 confirmed the operation's existence. The CIA officer who ran it, George White, kept personal journals that were subsequently donated to a university. Extracts from those journals described his enthusiastic participation in the program and his pleasure in watching the effects of LSD on unwitting subjects. White's journals include a description of 2 Orientals who were dosed and observed, and various other accounts of specific incidents. His correspondence with CIA supervisors treats the operation as both scientifically productive and personally enjoyable. One confirmed death resulted from the program's broader context. Frank Olson, an Army biological weapons researcher, was dosed with LSD without his consent at a CIA retreat in Maryland in 1953. He died 9 days later, falling from a window of a New York hotel. The death was ruled a suicide. President Ford apologized to his family in 1975. Subsequent investigation of his exhumed body found evidence suggesting he had been knocked unconscious before going through the window, and the New York District Attorney opened a homicide investigation in 1994. No charges were brought. The people who said the CIA was dosing unwitting civilians were right. Story 34, Prism and Upstream. The government was reading your email, and the companies all said no when Edward Snowden disclosed the existence of Prism in June 2013. The program's name appeared in a PowerPoint presentation that described it as providing the NSA with direct access to the servers of 9 major technology companies: Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Paltalk, YouTube, Skype, AOL, and Apple. The date each company joined the program was listed alongside its name. Every named company immediately and publicly denied participation. Google's founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page issued a statement saying they had not previously heard of Prism. Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg said he had never heard of the program. Apple said it had never heard of Prism. The denials were comprehensive and categorical. The denials were technically accurate and substantively misleading. Prism was not a backdoor in the technical sense of an unauthorized access point. It was a legal compliance system through which companies provided information to the NSA in response to FISA court orders. Through secure servers set up specifically for that purpose, the companies had not given direct access to their infrastructure in the way the NSA's own PowerPoint presentation implied. What they had given was access to specific user data through a compliant legal process that amounted to substantially the same thing. The NSA also ran a program called Upstream that collected data directly from fiber optic cables carrying internet traffic, collecting data before it reached the companies at all, without company knowledge or involvement. Prism and Upstream together provided access to the content of communications that the NSA's public characterization of its activities had not prepared the public to understand. The categorical denials were technically defensible. The substance of what was happening was what the Prism slide described. Story 35, the specific pattern. What declassification keeps confirming about how power works. We've been through 34 confirmed programs. MKultra and COINTELPRO, and Operation Northwoods, and the Gulf of Tonkin, and Operation Ajax, and Shamrock, and Gladio, and the Tuskegee Study, and the Phoenix Program, and the Church Committee's assassination plots, and the Senate Intelligence Committee's torture report, and the Pentagon Papers, and Naira, and Iran-Contra, and Operation Paperclip, and everything else on this list. Every one of these was described as paranoid when people first claimed it. Every one was confirmed when the documents became available, and every confirmation followed the same pattern. The pattern: a program is run. People inside it know. Some of them are uncomfortable, but continue. Occasionally, someone leaks something, or an investigation reaches the right files. The program is confirmed. Officials who ran it rarely face meaningful legal consequences. Institutional reforms are announced. The reforms are implemented incompletely. New programs develop in adjacent spaces. The specific lesson declassification teaches, not what any individual program did, but what the full accumulating record shows, is about the institutional conditions that produce these outcomes. None of them required a centralized conspiracy of people who wanted to harm their country. All of them were produced by people who believed their programs served legitimate purposes, who kept information compartmentalist to limit internal friction, who used classification to avoid external accountability, and who found that democratic institutions were structurally limited in their ability to check power that was exercised secretly. The lesson is not that governments are evil. The lesson is about the specific mechanics of how secret institutional power operates when democratic oversight depends on knowing what to look for, and the people who know aren't allowed to say. The documents that prove the next crazy theory may already exist. They're waiting for someone with the right clearance to decide they should be seen.